Hello, my name is Jaden Fallesen, and this is the Lest We Forget project over George W. Bush. First and foremost, I would like to talk about the specifications of this assignment. I was tasked with doing a deep dive into the life of an American hero, culprit, or even anti-hero. In doing this, I am making sure that we do not forget the people who made America what it is today. For this assignment, I chose to do it over George W. Bush, someone who some people call a hero and others hate. And the biography I used was George W. Bush, a biography, Greenwood Biographies. The author was Clark Roontree, and it was published November 2nd, 2010. And this is a credible source because it gives first-person accounts of his life from a reputable biography company in Greenwood Biographies. And this was just honestly a great read. I'm so glad that I got to dive deeper into his life, and this book was not only informational but very interesting. But let's get into who was George W. Bush. First and foremost, he was the 43rd President of the United States of America. That is what most people know him for, and honestly probably the reason that I'm doing the project over him today. But there were two groups who knew him during his presidency. One group knew him as a president who worked hard to stabilize our country during some of the worst days in recent history. Another group knew him as a scandalous leader who made terrible decisions when put into pressure situations. But why is he known as so controversial? Because obviously if there's two different groups of people who characterize him as something, then he must be controversial. But according to the Miller Center, George W. Bush was known as controversial because he had interesting policies and aggressive admission into the wars in Iraq. His administration gave too much power to the president himself, and his argued reaction to the terrible events of 9/11. But before we can get into how he was controversial, let's go into some of his personal background and early life. According to Britannica in the biography, he was born in New Haven, Connecticut on July 6, 1946. His parents were the 41st President, George Bush, who actually helped him into his campaign and politics in general, and George Bush's wife, Barbara Bush. George W. Bush's family life, he married Laura Bush right before his first presidential term in 2000, and he had two kids, Barbara and Jenna Bush. Well, let's first get into the early life of George W. Bush. George was the oldest of 6 children. During his younger years, they moved back and forth between Midland and Houston, Texas. For most of his life, he attended high-end boarding schools, received a bachelor's degree of history from Yale University, but on Yale standards, he was actually an average student and never excelled in any athletic event, which was very interesting because his father was an amazing student and was very athletic at the same time. Some more early life of George W. Bush, but from the biography account. In 1968, he worked on the Senate campaign of Edward Gurney in Florida. In the same year, he was accepted into the Texas National Guard. He continued to serve his country until 1973, where he is granted an early dishonorable discharge. George then enters Harvard Business School and graduates with an MBA. Yale and Harvard degree, that's pretty crazy if you ask me. But how did he get into politics? According to George W. Bush, a biography, first, he got into the business of politics when his father was elected the 41st president when he was younger. Began his own career but lost the congressional election to Democrat Kent Hance in 1978. He went back to the oil business and became a millionaire. From his success, he was able to run for president in 2000. He won this race. Now, let's get into more of the interesting things. What were the decisions and events that catapulted your figure into the historical record? Well, the very sole thing that catapulted him into the records was just the fact that he became the 43rd president. I feel like that's a pretty special honor to do, and something that will put you in any record book, no matter how good or bad you do. In doing this, he made some other decisions and lived through things that catapulted him deeper into these records. Honestly, he just lived through a crazy time in American life, and one of those decisions and one of those debated topics that he was involved in was the retaliation to 9/11. This included continuing to push for war in Afghanistan and Iraq. Some people believed in this, some people didn't, and honestly, whichever decision he made was, people were going to put it under a looking glass. Let's move on to the next. George W. Bush Shortcomings Explained. According to George W. Bush, a biography, George W. Bush's shortcomings were choices that were made with right intentions. People knew that he was trying to do what's best for our country. Some still believe that George's decisions changed the world and made it a better place, and others just said that his decisions needed to be better no matter the position he was in. But George was put in a tough position and was going to be judged no matter what he chose to do. And this picture on the right is actually one of the craziest things, which, I mean, there's a lot to name, but this was actually Hurricane Katrina, which he was president during, and he just had to make sure that people were safe, and this is just a representation of what he had to do in and through that. But let's get into how George W. Bush should be remembered. Should he be remembered for his shortcomings or for the good things that he did? Well, according to Pew Research Center, George W. Bush should be remembered for the great change that he brought to the country. He should be remembered for his help in creating organizations for people struggling with AIDS, for getting people through one of the most terrible terrorist attacks to ever plague our nation, being 9/11, for keeping people safe during a terrible hurricane, being Hurricane Katrina, and most of all, he should be known for standing strong in the midst of adversity and never losing his faith. This was one of the most, as I said, crazy times in America. The mid-2000s and just the 2000s in general was a time that our country was being attacked, and George W. Bush stood there and all and was able to get through 8 years of presidency, which is honestly just amazing, and he should be remembered for that either way. But how will I remember George W. Bush? I will remember him as someone who never backed down, no matter what stood against him. I remember him as someone who held strong to his faith in God, and I remember him as my president and a man who led this country with excellence. He did not let our country strive, but he went out and did something. Sometimes maybe it wasn't always the right thing, but he went out and put in the work and did something. Well, here are all my sites, that being Britannica, Miller Center, Public Integrity, Pew Research, PubHTM, and other Britannica and WSB.com. I'm so thankful that I got to do this project, and I really hope that you all enjoyed the life of George W. Bush just as much as I did.